Mr. Speaker.
Todd Barclay.
Thank you very much. It's an honour to rise to make a contribution in the first reading of the Drug, Alcohol Testing and Community-Based Offenders and Bailees legislation bill. It's pleasing to hear that the Labor Party will be supporting this bill, and I want to acknowledge a former Minister of Corrections at the other side of the House over there. I'll be interested to see how the Green Party votes on this one though, given that there are two pieces here that goes against the grain from what we've heard of them in the past, and that is being tougher on criminals and being tougher on the consumption and use of wacky-backy. So it'll be interesting to see how they vote. But I just wanted to touch on the purpose of this bill, which is it amends the Bail Act 2000, the Sentencing Act 2002 and the Parole Act 2002 to enable the Department of Corrections and Police to require community-based offenders and bailees who are subject to conditions prohibiting the use of drugs and alcohol to undergo drug and alcohol testing. And I agree with the statement made by Phil Goff. I think it would be probably consistent with most New Zealanders who would assume that this took place already. So it's a really a pleasing move, and I congratulate Minister Lutawinga for bringing this to the House. It's very important. I think at a fundamental level, where offenders are back in our communities, we want to support them in order to ensure that they stay away from their drivers of crime and keep our communities safe as well. And everybody who's spoken on this bill this evening so far has acknowledged the incredible contribution that drugs and alcohol makes in terms of encouraging and first-time offenders and also recidivism. So anything that we can do to stymie and prevent excessive consumption of alcohol and consumption of drugs at all will be very important in achieving the overall desire, which is reducing the level of crime and level of reoffending. So just as a bit of background, Mr. Speaker, at the moment police and correction staff are trying to ensure offenders and bailees comply with drug and alcohol conditions, but they are limited in what they can actually do. The current legislation doesn't give clear authority for them to test offenders or bailees for the presence of alcohol and or drugs. And so therefore this bill creates the opportunity and legislation mandate for alcohol and drug testing for eligible offenders and bailees. Yesterday in the Law and Order Select Committee we had the Department of Corrections come in for their financial review, and they outlined a number of initiatives that are taking place in order to reduce reoffending and increase rehabilitation. And the first is it sort of touches on and brings together the government's increased investment in three key areas, and the first is rehabilitation, including rehabilitation from drug and alcohol issues. The second is education, and the third is work experience. And I just want to briefly touch on each of those three because I think they relate to the purpose of this bill quite closely. So in terms of rehabilitation, we know that in the 2013-14 financial year there were 2,525 alcohol and drug treatments that took place by the Department of Corrections, and there were, in the same year, there were 5,262 interventions for prisoners, and that is an increase of 102% of alcohol and drug treatments since the year before that, and an increase of 310% of interventions in the year before that. So we can see that the increased investment and the increased focus that the Department of Corrections staff are putting on rehabilitation for drug and alcohol treatment is having an effect behind the cell doors, and so what this bill does is extends that one step further to ensure that it's also having an effect when these people are out in the communities, either on bail or on parole. Because I think that probably the risk for reoffending to take place and for criminals to slip back into drug and alcohol habits that they had while they were in prison and before they came in the first place, incredibly heightened when they leave prison. So that's why this bill is critically important in the wider picture in terms of the Department of Corrections strategy around rehabilitation. And the second is around education, and I'll just briefly explain how I think that relates to the drug and alcohol provisions that are in this bill, Mr. Speaker. I think the increase, yesterday when the Department of Corrections were in our Select Committee, they were talking about the increased investment and focus they're putting on education, and they're saying that every prisoner now has received an individual learning assessment and is receiving an individual learning plan, an education plan. And I initially assumed that that would be for trying to, vocational training and sort of enabling them to get into a job, into the workplace. But actually it goes right back to NCEA level 1. A lot of these people don't even have the basic qualifications that you receive when you're 15 to 16 years old at high school. And so if you don't even have NCEA level 1, 2 or 3, you're not going to have any chance of having any vocational training whatsoever, which reduces your chances of being able to be employable. And I suspect probably that was one of the major factors leading into these people entering the corrections system in the first place. And I think how that relates to this bill in terms of drug and alcohol treatment, if you're constantly seeking employment or seeking work opportunities and you're constantly being let down and you're not being taken on board due to your education and your qualifications, then as a depressant it probably drives you towards alcohol and drug consumption, because you don't know where else to go. You feel your self-esteem is very low. You're not being given opportunities to earn an employment, so you're therefore having to rely on other avenues to earn a living and provide for yourself and your family, which relates to probably gets people on the train of drug and alcohol consumption in the first place, Mr. Speaker. So the investment in the focus that the Department of Corrections is putting in the training and education space, in addition to rehabilitation of drug and alcohol treatment, I think goes hand in hand. And the third, work experience, which has the same relationship to drug and alcohol as what education does, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
But I think that the investment around and emphasis that the Department of Corrections are putting on behind the cell in terms of drug and alcohol rehabilitation, and the emphasis that they're now extending through the provisions in this bill, they're going to be putting on this past the cell gates as well, goes towards the wider sort of social policy approach that the government's taking. And I think while it relates incredibly to this bill, it also relates to a number of other bills that the law has been considering and is considering in my very limited time on the committee, 2 weeks as of yesterday. But it is nonetheless very important, and I think tying all of these things together, the work that's being done in police, corrections, social welfare, education and justice more broadly is very important in contributing towards the overall strategy around reducing offending, reducing reoffending, and trying to prevent as many people as possible from entering into the justice pipeline. So going back to the provisions of this bill,
that'd be good.
Mr. Goff focused on the principles that the bill outlines, which then gives some guidance to the Chief Executive, Department of Corrections and the Police Commissioner to then go ahead and set some more precise guidelines around that. And the following principles have been put in place to adhere to the human rights safeguards that need to be in place in such a bill.
Order. Right. That section has already been read out 4 times, and I think that's tedious repetition. No, you're... Kevin Haig.
Thank you.